Dear ladies and gentlemen, this is not a fictional story, it is completely true. And in this channel only true stories will be shared. Do subscribe. My name is Arthur Bell, and 3 months after my wife Diane's funeral, I was living out of a guest room in my own stepson's house. That's not a figure of speech. I mean it exactly the way it sounds. The house had been mine for 11 years, a modest 4-bedroom on Larkspur Street where Diane and I raised her son Kyle after his father passed when Kyle was 9. I loved that boy like my own from the day I married his mother. I coached his baseball team. I paid for his college. I walked him through 2 divorces and 1 bankruptcy without ever once bringing up the money I'd quietly put toward fixing both. But after Diane died, something in Kyle changed. Or maybe it had always been there and grief just stripped away whatever had been covering it. "Arthur," he said to me 3 weeks after the funeral, standing in the kitchen doorway with his wife Renee behind him, arms crossed, "we need to talk about arrangements long-term." "Arrangements," I repeated. "This house is a lot for one person. And honestly, with Mom gone, it doesn't really make sense for you to be here alone." Renee and I were thinking maybe it's time you looked at a smaller place, assisted living even, somewhere with people your age. I was 68 years old, not incapable, not confused. I had in fact spent the last 4 decades building something Kyle didn't know the first thing about, but more on that later. "This is my house, Kyle," I said carefully. "Your mother and I bought it together." "I know, Arthur, but look, be honest with yourself. Can you really keep up with this place alone? The yard, the bills, all of it. We just think it'd be easier on everyone if you moved somewhere more manageable." I understood even then what easier on everyone really meant. It meant easier for them to sell the house. I gave in faster than I probably should have. Grief does strange things to a person's will to fight. Within 6 weeks I'd signed papers I shouldn't have signed quite so quickly, and the house on Larkspur Street went up for sale. I moved into Kyle and Renee's guest room, just until I found something, Kyle assured me. That was 14 weeks ago. I was still there. Here is the thing about me that Kyle never bothered to learn in 11 years of calling me his stepfather. Before I met Diane, I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. And for the last 18 of those years I owned my own firm, Bell & Associates, specializing in commercial infrastructure projects across 3 states. I sold the firm 4 years before I retired, for a sum that would have made Kyle's eyes widen if he'd ever asked. He never did. To Kyle I was simply Arthur, the quiet man who married his mother, fixed things around the house and occasionally embarrassed him by wearing suspenders to family barbecues. What Kyle also didn't know was that after the sale of my firm, I hadn't simply put the money in a savings account and called it done. I'd spent the better part of 2 decades investing carefully, patiently in property, mostly overlooked commercial buildings in growing neighborhoods, purchased quietly through a small holding company that bore my late father's name instead of my own. Diane knew. Nobody else did. I wasn't hiding it out of secrecy for its own sake. I simply didn't see the need to advertise it, and frankly, I'd learned a long time ago that money changes how people treat you, and I preferred being treated like an ordinary man. That preference was about to cost me more than I expected, and then, eventually, pay off in a way I never could have predicted. The house on Larkspur Street sold within a month, a fast, clean transaction that netted just over $400,000 after the mortgage was paid off. Half of that, by law and by the terms of Diane's will, belonged to me outright. The other half, according to Diane's estate planning, was meant to be split between myself and Kyle, an arrangement Diane had made years earlier out of love for her son, never imagining the circumstances under which it would actually be executed. I didn't fight the split. I never once considered fighting it. Diane wanted her son taken care of, and honoring that felt like the last thing I could do for her. What I didn't expect was what came next. "Arthur," Kyle said about a week after the sale closed, sitting across from me at his kitchen table with a manila folder in front of him, "Renee and I have been talking, and look, we think it makes sense if we hold onto your portion too. Just for now. Set it aside for your care. Assisted living isn't cheap, and this way we know it's managed properly instead of you having to worry about it. Can manage my own money, Kyle. I know you think that. But Mom's gone, and I'm the one responsible for you now, whether either of us likes it or not. It's what she would have wanted." I looked at him for a long moment. Diane had never once said anything remotely like that to me, and I doubted very much she'd said it to Kyle either. "Appreciate the concern," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I'm not signing anything over to you. My half of that sale stays in my name." Kyle's jaw tightened, the way it used to when he was 9 years old and didn't get his way. "You're being difficult, Arthur. I'm being an adult," I said. "Something you might try." That conversation marked the beginning of a colder, harder version of my stepson than I'd ever seen, one that, over the following weeks, made it clear exactly how thin his patience with me had become. Things shifted quickly after that. Small comments became sharper. You really should think about assisted living, Arthur. It's not fair to Renee having to look after you. You don't contribute anything around here, you know. Least you could do is help with groceries. Mom barbied you. Somebody's got to be realistic now. I paid for groceries. I paid quietly for far more of the household expenses than either of them realized, simply because I didn't want to argue about it. But no amount of quiet generosity seemed to soften what was hardening in Kyle. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early spring. I came downstairs to find Kyle and Renee sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork between them, and the moment I walked in, they both went quiet in a way that told me everything before either of them said a word. "What's this?" I asked. Kyle slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a legal document, a request for guardianship, drafted by a lawyer I'd never heard of, citing concerns regarding Arthur Bell's capacity to manage his own financial affairs. I sat down slowly. "You're trying to have me declared incompetent." "It's not like that," Kyle said, though his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. "It's a protective measure, in case something happens. In case you start making decisions that put your finances at risk." "What decisions, Kyle? I haven't made a single financial decision in the last 4 months that you disapproved of because I haven't discussed my finances with you at all. That's the entire point." "That's exactly the problem," Renee said sharply, speaking for the first time. "You keep everything to yourself. Nobody knows what you're actually doing with your money, Arthur. For all we know, you're being taken advantage of by someone." Almost laughed. The idea that I, a man who'd spent 18 years running a successful engineering firm and building a real estate portfolio worth considerably more than either of them imagined, needed protecting from myself was almost funny if it hadn't been quite so insulting. "Not signing this," I said, sliding the folder back across the table. "You don't have to sign it," Kyle said, his voice hardening into something I barely recognized. "We already filed it. There's a hearing in 3 weeks. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the guest room, my temporary room in a house I'd once owned in a life that had somehow slipped sideways over the course of a few short months, and I made a decision. I called an old friend the next morning, a man named Harold Whitfield, who'd handled legal matters for Bell and Associates for nearly 2 decades before I sold the firm. "Arthur," he said once I'd explained the situation, "this is disgraceful. But it's also, unfortunately, not uncommon. And it's exactly the kind of thing that falls apart the moment real documentation enters the picture. Bring me everything, your investment records, the holding company paperwork, your financial statements, all of it." Over the following 3 weeks, Harold and I built a case that Kyle, Renee, and their lawyer had no idea was coming. They believed, genuinely believed, I think, that I was a modestly comfortable retiree with a house sale's worth of savings, and not much else. An easy case to make in front of a judge inclined toward caution with the elderly. They had no idea about the holding company. They had no idea about 11 commercial properties spread across 3 states, generating a monthly income that dwarfed anything either of them earned combined. They had no idea that Arthur Bell had for decades quietly been one of the more successful independent property investors in the region, operating so far beneath the radar that even his own stepson never thought to look. They were about to find out the courtroom was smaller than I expected, quieter too. Kyle sat with Renee and their lawyer at one table. I sat with Harold at the other, a thin folder in front of me that held considerably more weight than its size suggested. Kyle's lawyer opened with the argument they'd clearly rehearsed, an elderly widower, recently displaced from his home, exhibiting a pattern of isolation and secrecy around his finances that raised legitimate concerns about his capacity to manage his own affairs independently. It was, I'll admit, a reasonably compelling narrative, right up until Harold stood to respond. "Honor," Harold said, "I'd like to enter into evidence Mr. Bell's complete financial disclosure, prepared independently and certified by a licensed accountant, along with his professional history as founder and owner of Bell and Associates Engineering, and documentation of his real estate holding company, established under his late father's name in 1994. The judge reviewed the documents with a raised eyebrow that only grew more pronounced with each page. "Mr. Bell," she said eventually, "according to these records, you own 11 commercial properties valued collectively at just under $9 million, generating a documented monthly income well in excess of what most working professionals earn in a year. Is that accurate?" "It is, Your Honor," I said. Kyle's face, when I glanced over, had gone the color of old paper. "And you're telling this court," the judge continued, addressing Kyle and his lawyer now, "that this is the individual you're petitioning to have declared incapable of managing his own finances." Kyle's lawyer stammered through a response about how the petition was based on concerning behavioral patterns rather than the numbers themselves. But the ground beneath their entire case had just disappeared, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge dismissed the petition within the hour, with language in her ruling that didn't leave much room for interpretation. A finding that the petition had been filed without adequate basis, and a formal note in the record regarding the pattern of financial pressure Kyle and Renee had exerted on me in the months following Diane's death. Outside the courthouse, Kyle caught up with me in the parking lot, Renee trailing a few steps behind, her expression somewhere between shock and calculation. "Arthur, I had no idea," Kyle said. "About any of it, the properties, all of it. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because you never asked, Kyle. Not once in 11 years did you ask me a single question about my life before your mother. You saw a quiet man in suspenders who fixed the garbage disposal and paid for your college, and you decided that's all there was to see. That's not fair." I said. "You tried to have me declared incompetent 3 months after burying your mother, Kyle. Not because you believed it, because it was convenient. Because I was inconvenient, sitting in your guest room, taking up space you'd rather have back." He didn't have an answer for that because there wasn't one that would have made it better. I moved out within the week, into a property I already owned, a comfortable 2-bedroom condo I'd been renting out, conveniently vacant, that I simply hadn't bothered mentioning to anyone. I didn't cut Kyle off entirely. Diane wouldn't have wanted that, and despite everything, some small, stubborn part of me still loved the boy I'd raised, even now grown cold and grasping in his grief. But I also didn't rush back into trust. Trust, I'd learned rather late in life, has to be earned back slowly, the same way it's built the first time, through actions sustained over time, not through a single tearful apology in a parking lot. 6 months passed. Kyle reached out periodically, a phone call here, a visit there, always a little stiff, a little uncertain of his footing. Renee, for her part, mostly stayed away, unwilling or unable to face what her own hand in the guardianship petition had cost her. Then one evening in early autumn, Kyle called me sounding different than he had in months, smaller, more honest. "Arthur," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't expect it to fix anything. I've been seeing a counselor. Since the hearing, trying to figure out why I did what I did. I keep coming back to the fact that after Mom died I was terrified of money, of loss, of not having control over anything anymore. And instead of dealing with that like an adult, I tried to take control of you instead. That was wrong, and I'm not going to pretend there's a good excuse for it." I sat with that for a moment, the phone warm against my ear. "Thank you for saying that, Kyle," I said. "That's more honesty than I got out of you in the whole 3 weeks leading up to that hearing. I know I don't deserve trust back right away. I wanted you to know I'm trying. Actually trying, not just saying it." "That's a start," I said. "It's not nothing." Chapter 9. Slowly, carefully over the following year, Kyle did, in fact, keep trying. He started showing up without an agenda, no papers to sign, no arrangements to discuss, just a man visiting his stepfather because he wanted to, for the first time in longer than either of us cared to admit. He asked me questions he'd never bothered asking before, about the firm, about the properties, about the decades of my life that existed before Diane, before him. I found myself cautiously willing to answer. Renee never fully reconciled with what had happened, and eventually she and Kyle separated, not entirely because of the guardianship petition, but it hadn't helped, and Kyle told me once quietly that watching what his own fear had turned him into had cost him more than just my trust. I helped him eventually in ways that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the fact that he was, despite everything, still the boy I'd coached in Little League and walked through 2 divorces without complaint. When his small business hit a rough patch, I invested not out of guilt, but because I could see this time that he was building something honestly, asking for help instead of trying to take it. 2 years after that courtroom hearing, Kyle sat across from me at my kitchen table, my actual kitchen table, in the condo that had quietly become home, going through old photographs from a box I'd finally opened, one I hadn't touched since before Diane passed. "I still can't believe you never told me any of this," he said, holding up a photo of me standing in front of the first commercial building I'd ever purchased, decades younger, prouder than I remembered feeling in years. "I didn't want you to see me differently," I said. "I wanted you to know me as your mother's husband, not as a bank account." "I think I understand that now," Kyle said quietly. "I wish it hadn't taken almost losing you to figure it out." "You didn't lose me, Kyle," I said. "You lost your way for a little while. There's a difference if you're willing to find your way back, and you did." He looked up at me, something steadier in his eyes than I'd seen since before Diane's funeral, not quite the boy I'd raised, but perhaps finally becoming a man worth having raised. "What it's worth," I added, "your mother would be proud of who you're choosing to be now. that matters more than any hearing ever could. Outside, the late afternoon sun caught the window just right, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet in the room didn't feel like distance. It felt like something closer to home.